Everybody, this is your old pal, Uncle Hondo, your Las Vegas Raiders beat writer on Sports Illustrated and the host of the Las Vegas Raiders Insider Podcast. I literally just walked out of the locker room and came in here to tape today's podcast. We got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly going on with the Raiders right now. I know there are a lot of people that they've already tuned out the season. Their focus is completely ahead on the NFL draft. And I understand that completely. It's logical to me. It makes sense. And once they get to 10 losses, nine for sure, but 10, I'll do a lot more talk about that. But for right now, we're going to really talk about the good and the bad that's going on inside the Raiders and the ugly. And there is some ugly too. You all have seen it. So let's talk about it. Um, I think the good, first of all, is the mental mentality to hear or to watch Antonio Pierce's press conference today. We've got the video up and the audio up, however you get this podcast. And I asked him this question. I said, you know, every single week you're reading the injury report. Do you ever just think, oh my God, can I catch a break? I mean, I want you to think about that one. 50% of his defensive starting line, of the starting defensive line, out Christian Malcolm. You lose your quarterback, Marcus Epps, down all three corners last week. They just cannot catch a break. Now, that's not an excuse. Other teams have injuries, although this one has been decimated by it. This is why when you hear me talking about it during the draft in the offseason and free agency, getting depth. This is why when you hear about, boy, the Raiders are able to add this guy to the practice squad, because you don't win in the NFL without depth. Everybody gets injured. But AP's answer to me was, and there's no time because you're not going to get a break. One thing that has really stood out to me among this group, in fact, I was just talking to Colton Miller about it a minute ago, um, and a couple other guys about it as well. Tyree Wilson, I talked with him about it, but this is a group of guys where there isn't finger pointing and there's no quit, and they just keep battling. You saw it in Miami. The game got away from them late, but you saw in Miami how they just continued to battle and to fight and to scratch. If you are a Raider fan, and obviously if you're watching this, the chances are that you are, the thing that I think you want to watch for is guys quitting. That tells you that your franchise is in a lot of trouble, because that speaks to the character of the men getting paychecks. But you saw AP fire three coaches and Mark Ledham, talking about Mark Davis. I mean, you see guys that in the fourth quarter, it's a one score game and still battling when the easiest thing they can do is quit. You saw Max Crosby on Sunday talk about, we're playing for pride. And I think that is because I am one of the loudest voices beating the drum that this is not a rebuild, it's a reload. And I think that one of the things that tells you that is you have talent. I mean, think of all the guys that are injured, that if all of them were healthy, which they would be by the start of next year, that's very impressive. That doesn't speak of a roster in need of a rebuild. It needs a reload. But the fact that you don't have guys quitting, the fact that you don't have guys, coming up with hammy injuries, whatever, that speaks to you about the character of the men in the room. Every one of those guys knows they're 2-8. Every one of those guys know that the team is struggling. Every one of those guys knows that they're firing coaches, they're trying to fix things. But now one of them's quitting, and that's good. There's another thing that I don't think is getting talked about a lot, and I know that this isn't popular, but I don't do this to be popular. I do it because my job as reporter is to bring you accurate information, is the play of Colton Miller. When he got back, he had missed so much, and he was basically playing to get into game shape because they needed him so bad. But these last 5, 6 games, he has literally been one of the elite left tackles in all the National Football League. I noticed it, but I realized how big when a friend of mine from another organization, who is watching a lot of Raider film right now, pointed out to me how well Colton's playing. And I told him I noticed that he's playing dominant, very dominant. And as you hear the praise for these rookies, Jackson Powers Johnson, Delmar DJ Glaze, when you hear them talking about the impact Colton Miller's having, that's a guy who's a captain, who's controlling what he can control. He's healthy now. He's just a blue collar lunch pail guy, and they call him Cap because he's a captain. And he's the longest serving Raider right now. And Cap is, the way he's playing is at a very high level. So when you talk about good, I think you have to talk about that. He's playing very, very well. And I don't think it's something you can gloss over. Now, what happens is when teams are not doing well and you talk about anything that they're doing right, people act as if you're trying to brush over the fact that they're 2-8 in the middle of an utter disappointing season. Not trying to back out of that at all. In fact, I got an email from Francesa today, that I thought was really super good. I'm not going to read it today, but it's Francesa L from Sacramento. But basically saying, one other year I was way off on my prediction, and they wanted to know what had my prediction off this year. And I thought it was a great question. Francesa, I'm not going to bury it, but ask me at the end of the year. Right now, in the middle of the year, I'm not going to talk about it. I don't expect them to win, the next 7 games and come close to my prediction. I don't expect that. But I would encourage you to ask that after the season. And I promise I'm not going to, I wanted you just to know I'm not running from it. I own it 100%. And I'm going to get into a lot of detail of why I thought that in my prediction, but I wanted you to know I didn't. So that's the good. I think the good is the attitude of the team. I think you got a lot of rookies. I mean, Brock Bowers is playing like an all pro. DJ Delmar Glaze, the mule, is playing tremendously well. JPJ, DeCamerion Richardson playing really well. Brock Bowers playing really well. You're going to get to probably see Dylan Labe this weekend. Tommy freaking Eichenberg is, doing some things. Rookies are rookies. I just mentioned to the mule. I said, you make mistakes and you're going to make a lot more this year because you're a rookie. But one thing you don't do is repeat mistakes. That's why I love DJ Glaze and I love JPJ. But I love that all right, I'm going to get out here. I know I'm going to make a mistake. I don't care. I'm just going to maul somebody. Those are things that you have to talk about being 2-8. You have to talk about a disappointing season. You have to. That's Realville. And I live in Realville. But so many times people only want to talk about those things that are disappointing. And when you do, you sell yourself a opinion of your team that isn't realistic. So then you're like, oh my God, everything sucks. It's like that movie Waterboy with Rob Schneider. We suck again. And so what happens is everybody gets to the place where they're like, okay, blow up the whole thing. And then you have another 5-year rebuild. Well, that's not necessary with this team. There are a lot of good things going on. There are a lot of guys playing, at a good level. Now, there are a lot of guys playing at a disappointing level. Let's get to that. The bad. The bad is clearly young players make young player mistakes. And it's ugly, but it's what happens. It's just the way that the whole thing works. I mean, I was talking to Robbie Leonard, the defensive line coach, yesterday, and we were talking about it's very rare that a rookie defensive lineman just comes in and dominates. And even Will Anderson last year with Houston played really well, but wasn't dominant. I think that's one. I think there are some other ugly things that you see. Um, and that's when you see things that this team doesn't control. Okay, there's things they don't control. So a Decamerion Richardson comes in and a Rook, and okay, so teams naturally are going to go after him and attack him. Well, there's a learning process. And when you're the Raiders and you're this young, which you have to be a team of success, you got to build your own guys, you got to develop your own guys. There can become a sense of panic. And then all of a sudden, okay, I don't want to develop anybody. We got to be in a quest for a win. This team knows they need wins, but they also are smart enough to understand we're not going to throw away the future because we desperately need a win in a season where the only thing a win's going to do is push them further down the draft board. They're not tanking. I'm not implying that they are, but that's part of the ugly. The other one is you just fired 3 coaches. Clearly, there were mistakes in the hiring of some of the staff. And so it's ugly when you talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Excuse me, it's bad when you talk about there were some faulty, poor decisions made on hiring offensive staff that put this team behind the 8 ball. That's just the reality. And so when another team beats you, you can stomach it. You don't have to like it, you stomach it. But when you beat yourself, that hurts if you're a person of pride. And this is a locker room full of men of pride in a good way, not a bad pride. And so that is really where you come up here and have to address the issue of the elephant in the room is this team was um, put behind the 8 ball with some poor offensive hiring. And I think it hurt some players. I think it hurt some players' confidence. Um, and I think those are legitimate things to look at when you look at the bad. I mean, I think the bad is you've got some guys making rookie mistakes, but guess what? You never get a wily veteran if you don't have a rookie mistake. Okay, let's talk right now about Colton. I mean, he's one of the elite left tackles in all the National Football League. There would be a big market for Colton Miller if he were on the market. I don't think the Raiders should trade him. I'm not saying that they should, but that tells you how valuable the guy is. Okay, but Colton Miller didn't get here out of college and be the Colton Miller that he is today. Heck, he came back injured. I mean, when you look at it, the first 2, 3, 4 games, he wasn't even who he is today. He had to get back into that. I think the bad though is when you self-inflicted wounds. Now we're seeing that. I'm going to get into that more in the ugly, but we're seeing that. You're seeing a penalty by a Delmar DJ Glaze, a Jackson Powers Johnson, where all right, it's aggression. I was talking just a minute ago in the locker room with JPJ, and I talked about a couple weeks ago. I complimented him on his footwork, and I thought his handwork was exceptionally good this week compared to last. Well, he thought I was referring to the entire season, and he mentioned back to another game where he thought he had been better. But I was speaking about at center. His hands for being at center were a vast improvement in Miami. Now, were they where they should be at a veteran? No, but he's not a veteran learning a new position. So you can say, okay, it's bad when you got your center learning how to use his hands, but it's not really bad when it's a rookie. So it's understanding in totality the situation. Now let's get to the ugly. The ugly is when you have veterans who are giving maximum effort but making the unforced errors. It's inexcusable. And I believe those are coming from guys trying too hard. And I think that's been some of the ugly we've seen this year. All right, now let's talk real quick. Aiden O'Connell has not looked anywhere close to as good as he did last year, and neither has Gardner Minshew. So if you have multiple players not playing well, that reflects on coaching. So why are they not playing at that level? I think the scheme and I think the coaching. But you saw Scott Turner, Norv Turner, and Joe Philbin tightening it up. I just literally a minute ago in the locker room talking to some players about how much better this offense can get with another week. I was talking to Brock Bowers about that. So I think when you look at the ugly on this team, its coaching mistakes have been ugly, and then unforced errors by veterans trying too hard. Well, why are guys usually trying too hard? Because the team is underperforming. Now, I was raised by my father that every single thing rises and falls on leadership, whether it's a business, whether it's a football team, doesn't matter what it is. Everything rises and falls on leadership. So when you look at poor coaching, poor development, poor scheme, that's all on coaches. Okay. Well, you also have a rookie head coach who's learning the process. So all of those things are not excuses. It's just the reality. Now, for the Raiders moving forward, when you look at this team, obviously there is the immediacy of having the Denver Broncos come in here on Sunday. Then you go to a Black Friday affair uh, in Kansas City, up in Missouri. There's a lot of difficulty left on this schedule. You're not going to tank because your coaches and players are not going to do it, nor do you want them to. I know as a fan you want them to, but it just brings a disease into your franchise. I have a friend that played on a NFL team that tanked, and the team never reached any success level till they cleaned house and brought new people in. And years later, when he retired, him and I were out fishing on my boat, and I talked about the disappointment. And I asked him, "Why do you think you guys tanked? You got somebody. Why do you think it didn't work?" And he said, when the word came down about tanking, it set a culture that you can't change in a franchise. You can't just turn it on and off. That okay, it's okay to lose. It's not a big deal, and it is a big deal, and it frustrated him immensely. So I think those are things. When you look at the ugly on this team, it's veteran mistakes, but the other ugly is injuries. Now you're losing this many guys with injuries. I'm not blaming the strength and conditioning staff. I don't want anyone to hear that because everybody gets injuries. But when you start to get this many, you have to begin to look introspectively at every part of your organization. You got to look at training. You got to look at strength and conditioning. You got to look at all of it. Is it anything that they're doing? I don't know the answer to this. Is it anything that they can tweak or change? It's very important to look at that. We'll talk more about this in the off season. I promise you. Matter of fact, just please remember I said that. But we'll talk more about it in the off season. Not going to get into it right now. But those are things you have to look at. Those are things that you have to process. Why is all of this happening? Okay. There are some positions where the players you have are either too young to perform at the level you need or not good enough. Okay. Let's talk about Zamir. We know because it's factual, it's numbers, it's not opinion. Zamir White was one of the best running backs in the National Football League last year after Antonio Pierce took over. That's not the case. Now we know there's injury, but that has not been the case. Okay, well, why? You have to look at those things. And so when this team is evaluating every part of the organization, you have to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. You can't just focus on the ugly. Many of you know this. I've lost a lot of weight. And when I first started losing weight, I celebrated 1 pound. I will never forget when I really started dieting, and I'd been dieting about, I think 14 days is what I waited to get on the scale the first time. And I had gone down a few pounds. And I'll never forget I'm like, man, a few pounds, that's not much because I had a lot to lose. And I'll never forget my dad said to me, "You know how you eat an elephant?" I said, "No, sir." He said, "One bite at a time." And so when you're evaluating this team about the future, the answer isn't just get a high draft pick. We talked about that yesterday. But the answer is you have to be able to look and ascertain where are the weak links. Okay. When you see an offensive line struggle and everyone says the offensive line sucks, blow it up. Okay. But you got to remember there's a lot of young guys on there that are playing well for young guys. You got Colton Miller playing at an elite level. So the answer isn't you just blow the whole thing up. Do you need some more parts? Yes. Do you need some guys to mature? Yes. But it's not a throwaway. I think the Raiders are really keying in, obviously, on quarterback. I think they're looking and keying in at running back with all of their scouting. And there's some other positions that we're learning about, but they're looking at the entirety of the team. And you have to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm going to tell you in your life, when things are bad, you're going to want to focus on the bad. When they're good, you're going to want to focus on the good. And when they're ugly, you're going to want to focus on the ugly. But successful people learn to evaluate everything in totality. Now, when you're looking at your franchise in totality or your life and you start with the good, then you look at that. Then, but you got to move to the bad and then you got to move to the ugly. I think there's some guys on this team that the Raiders will need to move on from. No need to name anybody right now. It's not going to happen for weeks, and we're not trying to embarrass people. But there's some guys that have not performed well. There's not one guy that hasn't performed well, though, that whose effort is bad. Then there are some guys that have performed well, but they're young. And then there's some guys that are maybe not young, meaning rookies, but maybe third year guys that I think have been disappointed with some coaching. So the first thing that has to happen, and I talked about this yesterday, is this franchise is going to have to make a decision. What does it want to be? What are its expectations to be? And what are they looking at? Again, this is a team that has talent, but it's not a good football team right now. But I'll tell you what they are. Is they're a group of guys that haven't quit. You got a bunch of guys with a high football IQ and high football character. They're not just cashing paychecks. Their efforts there. And it just continues to reinforce to me this is not a rebuild, it's a reload. The good, the bad, and the ugly. It's all there. Thanks everybody for joining me. I appreciate it. We'll see you all again real soon. Again, thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you later.